Awesome.
Okay, while he's doing this, I'm going to get started. So today we're going to consider the aggregation of individual firms' supply functions to an industry supply. We'll start by doing that by adding up the supplies horizontally and deriving and using the concept of entry points on the price in which the firm enters into the industry to do that. And because some firms will enter at, this will create kinks and possibly even discontinuities in the aggregate supply, but uncertainty about those entry points will tend to smooth this out, and I'll show you how that works. Then we'll talk about free entry, barriers to entry, and the long run, and talk about how the rents that firms derive, the profits that they earn, come from them being more efficient than other firms. And we'll compare the textbook analysis in which you read about in Varian, in which in the long run entry eliminates profits, except when there are barriers to entry, to an analysis that I'll push a little bit, under which in reality, I think there are scarce talents that allow people to be in an industry and that stop people from entering the industry to drive out profits. And so then we'll talk about the distribution of talent, and in particular Zipf's law, as a regularity that what is this thing? We'll talk about Zipf's law as an empirical regularity on the nature of the distribution of talent in a society. Okay, and then this will set the stage for many of the things we're going to be studying throughout the rest of the course. So deriving industry supply from individual firm supply is pretty simple. Basically what you do is you just add up the supply curves horizontally. That is, at any given price, you sum together the amount being supplied by all of the individual firms. Now, this is particularly simple when all firms enter the industry at zero, because all that the supply curve is in that case is the inverse of individual firms' marginal cost curves. So the aggregate supply is the sum of the inverse of all the marginal cost curves at a given price. So if you then invert aggregate supply itself, that will give you the marginal cost of the industry as a whole. So let's consider a simple example. Let's imagine that there's an input I which costs $1, and that we have the production functions given here. I to times something to some power, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Christian, can you come up to the board, or if you want to do it with paper and pencil, you can do it that way, derive the total cost associated with these production functions?
I can do it on the board. Do we have an eraser?
Good question.
Okay.
Yeah, there's one.
There's one right there.
Yeah.
So Q equals 9/5 I to the 5/9.
Yeah.
Then we just want to get I in terms of Q. So
Because we know that each unit of I costs $1, so that's the
Yeah.
same as the cost. Yeah.
So then we just invert it, so I equals 5 minus Q to the 9/5. And do we do that for all of them?
Yeah.
Okay. Then for the next one, I equals 5/3 Q cubed. Then for the next one, I equals 5/3 Q squared. And then for the last one, I equals 5Q to the 7/5.
Very nicely done. Okay, so that's exactly what he just did. So now, Austin, can you derive the marginal costs from those?
Marginal cost for these?
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Okay, so those are the total costs. How do you derive marginal cost from total cost?
I'm blanking.
Marginal cost is the cost of the marginal unit,
Right.
the next one, right? And that is the rate at which the total changes when you increase the quantity, right? So how do you derive it?
So it's the derivative.
Yes, exactly. There's a trick.
What am I missing?
No, you've got it, but there's a trick. See, you bring that down and it cancels with the 5/9. I've set it up that way to make it easy for you. Oh, that one's not quite right.
This last one.
Yeah, that's 10/3 because there I tricked you by having the trick and then not having it. And then the last one you get 7 there, right? Okay. So, Ming, is Ming here?
Yeah.
Yeah, hey Ming. Can you derive the supply functions from those marginal costs?
Sorry.
No, I think it's okay.
I'm just used to it. It's just the inverse, right?
Yeah. So you see, we got from production functions to total cost by inverting. Then we took a derivative, then we inverted again. You see, it's just the same steps over and over again.
Wait, is that right?
No, it's not 1 over it. It's the inverse function.
Is it 5/4?
It's q to the 4/5 is equal to p, and so you have to then find q as a function of p.
Wait, sorry.
Right, the marginal cost
Yeah.
is set equal to the price.
Mhm.
So p equals q to the 4/5.
Yeah.
And then you solve for q in terms of p. Exactly, that's the supply function for the first firm. So then what about the second firm?
Wait, I have the definition on my brain's not working today.
Yep.
What's this? Is this 50 over, what's this number?
No, that's 10 over 3 times q.
10
The 5 shouldn't be there.
Ah, right, okay. 10 over 3 times here. Okay. So that would be 3. And then that would be
Right? And then for this last one, you didn't do it, but it's 7 times q to the 2/5.
wait, this is the production function.
Yeah, but the marginal cost is 7 times q to the 2/5.
7 times Q to the 2. Okay.
You guys see how that works? Yeah, Dave.
Could you explain the intuition behind that math just really quickly?
Okay, so firms, the production function turns into the cost function just because that's how much input you need in order to produce that output.
Yep.
Derivative of total cost is marginal cost. And then marginal cost, they produce up to the point where marginal cost equals to price,
Wait.
right?
Yep.
And so you invert the marginal cost in order to obtain the supply function.
Oh, in order to, yeah, okay.
Okay, so, yeah, that's exactly what Ming just did. And then the industry supply function is just the sum of all of these things together. So to graph, I'm going to switch the axes. So these are the individual firm supply functions that we just derived. And then we add them up horizontally to obtain this industry supply function. Okay, so this was nice and simple because all the firms were entered the industry at price of 0. That is, they were all willing to produce as soon as the price was anything positive at all, right? But many firms, if they have fixed cost, would not be willing to enter an industry if the price were very, very small. They might require a price that was higher, significantly above 0, before they would be willing to enter the industry in the first place. So let's go through some examples of that. Victor? Where's Victor? Victor? Is he here? Oh. Anyone else want to derive the marginal costs from these total cost functions? Rishi. Yeah, why don't you come up and do it? Or you can just read it off if you just know what it is. But
so it'd be Q, and then
yep.
1/3 Q, 4 plus 5Q.
This thing you said was 1/3 Q?
Oh, sorry, it's 1 plus
1/3 Q. Yeah.
4 plus 5Q, 7 plus 1/15 Q.
Yeah, exactly. You see how he did that? Because all the things were just quadratic, right? And so you just brought down the 2 and that gave it to you, right? Okay, so those are the marginal costs derived. So Mitch? Is Mitch here? No? Okay. Anyone else want to derive the supply functions from those? Wesley, right? Yeah.
So, just the invert, right?
Uh-huh, but do these firms want to enter the industry when the price is equal to 0? Imagine if the price were 1 cent, would all these firms want to be producing at all?
No, only when it's profitable.
Yeah, so at what price does each of these firms enter the industry, and then what is their supply once they've entered the industry?
The price that's the minimum on their average cost curve, or where the average cost is at minimum cost.
Well, what is the lowest cost that any of these firms faces for each one of them? So this firm, if it produces 0,
Right.
its marginal cost is 0.
Okay.
What's this firm's marginal cost if it produces 0? So what price would it be willing to enter the industry?
Just 1.
Yeah,
Okay.
right? Because if the price is less than 1, then they're making losses on even the first unit, right?
Okay. So then that one would enter at 4.
Yeah.
And that one would enter at 7.
Okay, and then what are their supply functions conditional on them entering?
Okay, well, so the first one's supply function would just be P,
Yeah,
right? But that would start at the price of 0.
yeah,
The second one would be 3 times quantity P minus 1,
exactly,
and that would start at 1.
exactly,
Okay, so it's discontinuous.
yeah,
The third one would start at, it would be 5 times quantity P minus 4. I mean, 1/5 times
Yeah,
quantity P
exactly.
minus 4, starting at 4. And then the
the last one would be 15 times quantity would be minus 7.
Makes
So,
sense.
okay.
Yeah? Yeah. Remind me of your name again. Maury, right? Okay, good.
If, like, assuming these firms were, like, running, or, like, already in the market,
Mhm.
they would continue to produce until the price was, like, the coefficient in front of the Q, right?
Yeah, exactly. So they would exit if the price was below this.
Was below the, like...
If they were
the second
already
one
in the
from
industry.
third?
Yeah.
Okay. So why would they only want to enter once their fixed costs have been met?
There's no fixed costs here. Everything's marginal costs here. We'll talk about fixed costs in a second.
I mean, just the number before the Q, like, in the second one, the 1.
Because otherwise, I mean, that's like the lowest cost that they face. Everything, I mean, like imagine that, you know, on your first unit, all you need to do is buy the fuel. But if the fuel already costs quite a bit, then you're never going to run a flight unless someone at least gives you enough to meet your fuel needs. Right? And that's the point here. If like the marginal cost starts somewhere and then goes up from there, they're not going to be willing to produce anything until the price at least gets above that minimum level. Remind me of your name. Sual.
Sorry, so those are cost functions, right? So
Those are marginal cost functions.
oh right,
Yeah.
never mind.
Yeah.
I thought they were cost
No.
functions. Yeah.
Okay. So if we add all these things up, what we're going to get is a supply function with kinks. So I'll show that to you. So the reason is that the individual supply functions, one starts here and goes up like that, one starts here, goes up like that, etc., etc. So when you add them up, you get kinks at the point at which each firm enters the industry. Okay. However, if they enter at a positive quantity, which will typically happen when there's fixed costs, there are actual discontinuities, not just entry that causes kinks. So imagine that you had firms with fixed costs of respectively 0, 25/6, 5/4, 40/30, and their variable costs were given by these. Well, then you could form their average costs as well as their marginal costs, and you have to, they're only going to produce at the point where the marginal cost is above the average cost. But so now they're going to have actually exactly the same supply functions as they had up there because the marginal cost functions are the same, but they're going to enter producing, in the first case, 0, because he had 0 fixed costs. But in the second case, when he first enters, the minimum amount he'll be willing to produce is 5. And the third guy, minimum amount he'll be willing to produce is 1. And the fourth guy, the minimum amount he'll be willing to produce is 20. Because once he enters, he's able to defray his fixed costs, and he'll enter at a positive quantity because he needs to sell enough to defray his fixed costs. Okay, so the way you do that is you look at the marginal cost, and that's going to intersect with the average cost somewhere. This is like one example of those curves. And the entry point is here. He enters at this price, but at this quantity, which is greater than 0. Right? And so that leads under those curves to these discontinuous supply functions for each firm. Not only are there kinks, there are actually jumps. And when you add those up, you get an industry supply curve that's jumpy like that. Okay. So I'm sure you can imagine that mathematically this is kind of annoying because it makes it difficult to use calculus. And it creates some paradoxes. Like, what if you had the demand curve and it cut through this gap here? What would happen exactly? Right? Yeah, Julian, right?
Yeah, so what line is the industry supply there?
Well, it's this thing over here. But you see it's all broken up.
So is the orange line one of the lines that's in the industry supply, or is it not?
Yes. This thing is the industry supply. I had to graph it as a piecewise function, so it came out a bunch of different colors. But, yeah.
So any firm has a fixed cost, and would it be discontinuous or at least have some kinks?
Pretty much any firm that has a fixed cost will enter at a positive price, and it will have, unless it has 0 marginal cost. if it is zero marginal cost, then it will enter at price of 0, but it will enter at a positive quantity. Yeah, Austin.
How kinky are real industry supply curves?
Okay. Well, this is what I was going to talk about now. Okay, so one question is, what happens if demand falls into one of those gaps? Is there no supply there? What do we even make of that? Now, in practice, this is not as big of a problem as it appears for the reasons that Austin was starting to get at. So firms may have entry points, but usually we don't know exactly what that entry point is for certain, right? Because it depends on the setting, and it's sort of unpredictable, and that uncertainty will smooth out the supply curve. So if you think about average or expected supply, it will be smooth. The second thing is that if the discontinuities are small, then they don't matter very much. And if any given firm's output is a small part of the industry's output, then all the discontinuities have to be small. Because if the firm's total output is small, then its entry point has to be small as well. So in the real world, individual firms might make a big difference, right? It might not be the case that there are like a huge number of firms in an industry. But if that's true, then we shouldn't really be using a perfectly competitive model anyway. What would really happen if the demand curve went through one of these points is that this firm would realize, oh, the market is like really relying on me to supply this extra quantity. I'm going to raise the price up. You see what I mean? So just the fact that we use the price-taking assumption sort of rules out a lot of these kinky things. It's not that things can't be kinky. It's that if they are kinky, then, or have jumps in them especially, then that means that one firm is very important to the operation of the industry as a whole, and that an oligopoly model is a better way to think about things than a perfectly competitive model. So almost any time you use perfect competition, it makes sense to assume a more smooth supply function, because if that weren't the case, then perfect competition wouldn't be the right way to model the problem. Okay. So to get a basic idea of how uncertainty can smooth things out, let's take a simple example. Imagine that there are 5 firms, and each one is only ever going to produce 1 unit. It'll either produce 1 unit or no units, right? And so the only relevant question for the firms is at what price they'll start producing. But imagine we're uncertain about this, and that it follows, and don't be too worried if you don't know this sort of notation, but it has a probability distribution that has an exponential distribution, let's say, for different parameters. So then the question is, what is the expected industry supply if this is the probability that any given firm, running 1 through 5, has an entry price, the price at which they're willing to sell that 1 unit, below that value. Kim, do you know what the industry supply would be then? Okay, so this is the probability. What would be the expected amount that the industry supplies if the price was equal to price P, if this is the probability that the firm will be willing to sell its 1 unit at a price less than P. Well, the amount supplied by any given firm on average, right, is just the probability that their entry point is below the price in the market, right? So if we ask what's the amount supplied by all the firms, what would that be? Imagine that it's independent across firms.
You have to sum them up.
Yeah, you just add up all those functions, right? So it would be 5 minus e to the negative 1 p minus e to the negative 2p minus e to the negative 3p, etc. So this is perfectly smooth, even though each individual firm, in fact, has a jump in its supply. And the reason is because we're uncertain about the point at which that jump occurs, so the average production is smooth, right? So this is what the individual firm expected supplies look like, and they sum up to this nice, smooth industry expected supply. Bharat, right?
Yeah. Sorry, why is there, can you explain like the uncertainty in like whether or not they supply?
So the point is that imagine that we just don't know as an external observer and economist exactly what point at which the firm is going to enter the industry, right? Then from our perspective, all we can know is what the average supply is going to be, right? And that average supply will be smooth even though the actual supply is going to have these jumps in it. You see what I mean? Because of our uncertainty, it smooths things out. Sual. Okay, you just said that.
Could you just explain the previous picture again, like why like each of the firms, like how you were able to graph each of the firms if you didn't really know what their supply would be?
Well, because this is their expected supply. So that's if the price is equal to a certain amount, what is the probability that they're going to be supplying their one unit, right? If they supply their unit with 50% chance, then the expected supply is 0.5. If they supply their unit with 100% chance, then the expected supply is 1.
How are these probabilities like determined?
Well, by this function that I gave you. Yeah, Dick.
So if you have them producing different units, you just have the, like, say a firm produces 5 units, another one produces 7, you just have that times the probability of that firm producing that number of units. And then
Yeah, so you have like, a distribution of units produced by one firm, a distribution of units produced by the other firm, conditional on price, and you add those all up horizontally, which can be a little bit messy probability-wise. But this is something we'll use a lot. We'll, rather than necessarily having, a supply function, we'll have someone who maybe is only supplying 1 unit, but we're uncertain about whether they'll supply it or not. So on average, the amount that they'll do. So for example, in auctions, for example, when someone's buying, right, you think auction, they either buy it or they don't. That's not the right way to think about an auction. The right way to think about an auction is what is the average amount that they buy, where amount that they buy is the probability of them buying it as a function of the price that you set, right? And so that's how you form a smooth demand curve out of an auction, because you don't know what the chance, what they're willing to pay. Tanner.
What's the y-axis measure?
This is price.
Okay.
Price is the y-axis. Total units in expectation is on the x-axis. Adam.
I'm just confused, so in the real world, when you're trying to figure out a supply curve, how would you know what firms would enter at certain prices?
Well, you don't know. That's exactly the point. And so you have to have some way to summarize the uncertainty you have about that. And you use probability distributions to do that. So you say, well, look, I don't know, but it's probably approximately this, and it probably has a spread of this. And you use a probability distribution to do that. And we'll talk about one particular probability distribution that's useful, the Pareto distribution, because it's a good approximation to the distribution of talent. Charles, yeah?
Yeah, so in this graph is the blue firm over here, the least likely to enter early.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So at this price, well, we're getting on average half the firms entering, because on average we're halfway up their curve. And at this price, most of the firms are likely entering, and as we get higher, the chance that all of them are entering is getting higher and higher. Okay. So in these pictures, firms were earning positive profits, right? Because on average, say, imagine that the price were this. On average, this firm is going to be producing for a price that's is going to be willing to produce at a price that's way less than that, and so on average they're going to earn a profit that's equal to the area in between, right? What determines the size of these, Kim? What determines the size of the profits that the firm earns?
How much do they produce?
Yeah, so the more they produce, the more profits they're going to earn, right? What else plays a role in determining that? Yeah, so but can you give a little bit more of a sense, in the graph or intuitively, what that relates to? So like, let's look back at this picture. Which of these firms is earning the most profits at any given price? Well, the blue one is the one that's least likely to produce, so he's not going to be earning it. These guys who produce more are more likely to be earning it. But also, it's not really the fact that at this price they're producing that much more, because they're really not producing that much more. It's really that they would have been willing to produce at lower prices, right? The fact that their curve stays flat until you get towards the price, right? That's what makes them make a lot of profit, right?
Or wouldn't that be producer surplus as opposed to profit?
Yeah, let's call it you can call it whatever you want. They're basically, I view them as the same thing. So this is, but remember that the prices in a market are determined by how much everybody else produces, by an intersection between supply and demand, right? And so what's really important, given that imagine that we had a demand curve that was down like this, right? It would be mostly everybody else's production that would determine what the equilibrium price was, right? And so what really matters is how much more efficient you are than everybody else in the market, how much profit you're going to earn, right? So I view it as there being two basic sources of rents under perfect competition. One is that you're able to produce more because you're able to keep your marginal costs down for a longer range of quantities. But the second, and maybe more interesting thing, is that at the marginal cost price, at the market price, if your average costs are really low relative to the marginal costs of everyone else in the market, then you're going to be making a lot of profits. So what does that mean? You always produce up to the point where the price is equal to your marginal cost, right? But you're going to make more profits the higher those marginal costs are relative to your average cost. Now, what would you call I would call something where the marginal cost is much higher than the average cost very stressed or stressed out. Why would I say that? Because it means that on the margin they're producing a lot less than they're producing on average. That is, like, their productivity for the next unit is much lower than their average productivity overall. If you think, when you get stressed out, right, it's because you're being asked to do so much that, on the margin, you're not able to achieve very much because you have so much but on average, you're much more productive than that. Your sort of capacity has been worn down to the point where you're much less productive. And what this says is that in a competitive equilibrium, you actually want to be stressed out. The more stressed out you are, the more rents you're making. Because if you're someone who's extremely valuable, right, people are going to want you to do a lot up to the point where you're no longer that valuable on the margin, right? So when you see people who are stressed out, like, the best doctors, the best restaurants that are overflowing with people, talented people who are constantly having to turn down offers, that's the logic of the market, right, at work. Yeah, Tanner?
Can you explain the first part of that one, the stretches of bar?
Well, that just means that you can keep that marginal cost low over a wide range of quantities. So, like, you can keep producing at low marginal cost. So that allows you to produce more than the other person.
So the arrangement to the stress margin means you keep it low for a long time.
So there are two different things. The first one is you want to be producing a lot, which requires you to keep your marginal cost low over a wide range. But then, given how much you're producing, you want your average cost to be low relative to your marginal cost at that point.
So you want your marginal cost to be low relative to everyone else, but your marginal cost to be high relative to your average cost.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Hey, Mike.
Is that why in the previous graph, the best firms are the ones making the most profits have very, flat curves? And then they, build?
Exactly. Exactly. Okay, so a natural question is, shouldn't these profits that firms are earning attract other firms to enter the industry? And this is a very classic idea, that in the long run, if there's free entry, firms will earn no profits. Another way of putting this is that it's only short-term advantages that allow firms to earn profits. So for example, in California there was a gold rush, and all the people who were on the spot when the gold rush started made a lot of money. But then everyone rushed in, and all the profits went away, and people lived pretty miserably, right? And anytime someone has profits, someone else will try to imitate them. So for example, Groupon came into the market, but they didn't really have anything all that distinctive, and very quickly everyone copied what they were doing, and they are not doing so well now. Similarly, if one firm has a better technology than another firm, you should expect other firms to switch to that technology so they can more effectively compete. So for example, Apple was one of the first companies to really come out with one of these touch screen cell phones, but very quickly after that, because they didn't have anything to protect them on that, other firms entered to imitate them, right? And on the other hand, any firm that is making losses will want to exit the market. And there's a very famous Onion story about this that I love that I'm going to read to you. Onion. Yeah. Yeah. Well, so this is sort of illustrating the idea by its failure. So. You guys can just read it yourselves. Okay, so that's the principle that not only free entry, but also that any firm that doesn't produce anything that's worth any money should have to exit the market, right? And as a result, the long-run supply curve should be flat at the minimum of the average cost curve, where the average cost curve is defined over all possible technologies firms could use, and every firm is viewed in this vision as just using one short-run technology. Now that's not quite true. It doesn't quite have to be flat, even in this view, if there's a small number of firms and entry occurs at a non-trivial fraction of total quantity. Because then demand needs to grow by enough to make it worth another firm entering, right? So if the price, if you get price going up to here, right, then another firm will enter down at this price because they wouldn't be willing to enter until you got to this price, right? So because of that lumpiness, you might have it being a little jagged like this. But again, as the number of firms gets large, right, those problems, as we mentioned, go away. So what you'd see is, there would be a little bit of steepness here, but as more and more firms entered, all those firms would be adjusting, right? And so the amount of steepness would get lower and lower and lower. Yeah, Christian.
And usually those jumps, like if we're approximating with a flat curve, the jumps would happen at trivial quantities?
Yeah, at very small quantities when there's a small number of firms in the industry. Right. But again, perfect competition wouldn't be a very good assumption in that case, right? Okay. So this process of competition can, of course, be inhibited by government policy or by private violence. And these impediments are called barriers to entry. Is Andrew here?
Yeah.
Yeah. Andrew, could you give some examples of barriers to entry?
I guess like liquor license laws.
Uh-huh.
So if you limit the number of people that can actually sell liquor in retail.
That's a very good example. Yeah. So doctors, taxi drivers who have medallions, a similar idea. Regulatory barriers like forcing people in order to get into an industry to comply with Sarbanes-Oxley, right? That's like very, very costly, and that could keep firms out of the industry because they now have to comply with all sorts of regulations. Violence by illegal drug cartels in Mexico is another important barrier to entry into the drug industry in Mexico. Also, just petty harassment or bigotry is a big impediment to entry. So a lot of minority-owned businesses, where the person is a minority, racial minority within whatever neighborhood, are harassed to the point where it's very hard for them to enter and compete. Contractual arrangements can also do this. by exploiting market dominance in other areas. So in Peru, when they opened up to free trade with the United States because they thought it would bring them competition, they got a nasty surprise and found out that it could also bring large U.S. companies that could buy up all the competing companies within Brazil because they have no antitrust laws and turn it into a giant cartel. So SAB Miller came into Peru, and rather than competing with the Peruvian brands, they bought up all the brands and they raised the prices on beer. Now they had to avoid anyone trying to come into the country to compete with them. So what they did is they went to all of the posts along the beach in Brazil, which is where about 40% of beer in Brazil is consumed, because people like to go to the beach and drink beer there. And so they went to all the posts on the beach and they said, either you have to carry our beer, either you can't carry our beer, or you have to only carry our beer, right? You have to have an exclusive arrangement with us. And that, they couldn't afford to be cut off from all the Peruvian beer brands, right? And so they did exclusive deals with with SAB Miller, and that made it very, very hard for foreigners to come in and compete with them. Now, these types of barriers to entry are usually created by lobbying, violence, or exploitation of market power. And economists usually call these activities rent-seeking. And we view them as bad for three principal reasons. What are those reasons, Adam?
Well, one main thing would be it would artificially kind of affect supply, and on that basis, artificially affect price.
That's right. So it'll inefficiently allocate goods. What are the other potentially harmful effects?
Also, there'd be like a focus on like the lobbying or whatever like means to achieve that instead of actually focusing.
Yeah, so they're spending a lot of resources on trying to do that, right? And finally, it usually benefits a favored group, right? So like this company, why should they make the money? Why shouldn't the consumers have that? We don't necessarily think that's a good distribution of those resources. Now, I think the most important of these reasons is the waste that's spent on trying to acquire these privileges. And the reason I think that is that we often do give barriers to entry, and we think it's a good, beneficial thing for policy to do in the context of intellectual property, like patents, trademarks, copyrights that prevent people from competing with existing firms. Because we know that potentially without those, free entry will drive profits to zero. But then, of course, how would firms recoup the costs of investing in creating those creative products, right? Well, now we're going to discuss this extensively in Lecture 13, but the key point I want to make here is that this isn't a barrier to entry we generally think is good, because the things that are incentivized by the profits are not lobbying or violence, right? They're creating valuable new ideas for society, right? So what really makes profits like this, or barriers to entry like this, good or bad, I think, is where the rents that they create go. So when rents go to drug mafias, this is really, really bad, because this encourages them to be extremely violent to compete for dominance of the drug market and to kill all sorts of people in the process. On the other hand, and this is very self-serving, the rents that I get from you guys wanting to listen to me teach you because I have published papers in journals and so forth are a way of encouraging me to create those ideas, right? Similarly, a lot of people are willing to pay a huge amount of money to have an authentic work of art, even if they could never in any way tell that from a fake. Why? Well, I think it's socially beneficial because it gives the original artist an incentive to create the work. Why should we care whether it's a fake or a real? Well, it's just a social taboo, but it's a useful social taboo because it encourages the artists to create art. So one question I've always had about this is whether all the rents that people get for producing drugs that prolong people's lives at the very end of their lives are really good or bad. And the reason is, of course, they benefit people by extending their lives, But we as a society spend a huge amount on the last 2 weeks of lives, really to only extend them by a very, very small amount. And I think the reason that that happens is that a lot of the old people who are dying would rather just die in peace rather than live in pain for longer. And their children would probably rather save the money. But the problem is that the children think that the parents think that if they don't force them to stay alive, that they don't love them and want to save the money, right? And so you get stuck in this cycle of both forcing each other to do this very wasteful thing. And as a result, one thing I've advocated was that you could have, a populist policy where you say, look, it's fine if you want to charge, a young person something for preventative care, whatever. But when it's at the end of life with grandma, you have no right to earn a profit off of that. You should be absolutely required to sell that at cost so that everyone has access to that. And that would sound very populist and, left-wing, but what it would actually have the effect of doing is discouraging all innovation in that area and therefore stopping innovations that would increase the cost, right? So I thought that that's like a politically palatable way to stop healthcare costs from rising. Yeah, Christian.
So, for the rents for this stuff?
Yeah.
Is that just like in place because of the social taboos, like the authentic art? Like it's only in place because people think they should?
No, it's because of the intellectual property that these guys get on it. But I think, what we should say is we should have a populist campaign that, intellectual property is fine on stuff, that's not at the end of life, because this is like the most taboo area, right? But we can say, when it's grandma dying on her deathbed, you have no right to make a profit off of that. Yes, who else?
What if innovation in that area, for end-of-life innovation, actually reduces the costs of prolonging the end of life? Wouldn't that be a positive benefit?
If it reduces the cost, I'm all for it. If it allows at very, very high cost, especially because of the patent, someone to extend their life in misery for an extra few days, I think that's very bad. Yeah, Austin.
I remember reading that a discontinuity in the inheritance tax created a big discontinuity in death rates.
Yeah, I have heard about that. I think it's pretty small, actually. I mean, I think it's a few thousand people died a few months earlier than they should have died, but I don't think there were that many deaths that would not have otherwise occurred. Yeah. In other words, it went up and then it went back down. There was it was when the capital gains tax went down, they sold their stocks a year earlier, but it's not like they actually sold more stocks than they otherwise would have sold. All these people were going to die. They just decided to die a little bit earlier.
Yeah, there was 25% more deaths on December 31st than on January 1st.
Yeah, exactly. But that could be because a 12.5 increase on one day and a 12.5 decrease on the other. You know what I mean? So, yeah, Evan.
How many of these drugs are made to just give people a few extra weeks, and how many of them are made to try and fit and give people years, and they just need to recoup the cost because it didn't work?
That's an interesting question. I mean, what Pigu's principle would tell us is that if you reduce the rents for the state of the world where you end up, not extending it by years, then you'll selectively discourage things that are targeted that way. We might not know what the original intentions are, but if we pay people for their final product, we're more likely to get that type of stuff being created. You know what I mean? But that's a good question. Okay, so regardless of whether barriers to entry are good or bad, these barriers are external to the market. And the usual idea is that the market left to itself would essentially eliminate profits. And this is one of the deepest and oldest and most cited ideas in economics, and it's quite useful and right in some contexts like intellectual property. But actually, I think it's much less broadly applicable than you might have learned or might think. And the rest of the lecture covers the natural limits that exist to the principle of free entry. So the basic problem is that many activities require talent. If a technology is such that any idiot can implement the optimal technology, then sure, free entry will eliminate profits. But this is only possible in limited circumstances. Someone might say to you, oh, Steve Jobs is making a lot of profits. Why don't you just enter into being Steve Jobs? That might not be that easy. Or LeBron James is making a lot of money. Why don't you just become LeBron James? Well, I'm not sure everyone can do that costlessly, right? Because talent is scarce, it will command a rent. And this is a barrier to entry, but there's nothing like artificial or government imposed about it, right? What free entry really requires is the absence of a need for talent. Yeah, Julian.
Well, obviously you can't, if you want, you can't be Steve Jobs, but a firm could hire Steve Jobs, and then it would just cost them a lot of money to hire Steve Jobs if he's the whole reason why Apple's making all those profits, right?
Yeah, but the question is, what is a firm then? Is this? I mean, any company that hires Steve Jobs sort of is Apple in some sense. You know what I mean? I'm not sure Apple was all that much more than Steve Jobs and what he created, As we found out after they fired him and they went down the tubes, right? Yeah, Bharat.
So would that imply that if the human capital of less productive people was raised, that would drive profits towards zero?
Yeah. I mean, if it's raised up to the level of the people that they're competing with, absolutely. Because then they don't have the lead out in front of the other guys. Yeah, Austin.
How do rapidly prototyped kind of internet startups like Twitter come into this then? Because they don't arguably have brilliant ideas, and at least today it's not terribly difficult to create the services at the beginning, and yet they're able to reap massive profits.
Well, I think it depends a lot on the degree of economies of scale. Twitter has a huge economies of scale effect because of the network effects that exist in that industry. And that means that only one firm can really exist, whereas Groupon didn't have very many economies of scale, and therefore it was very easy for someone to enter and compete with them. Whereas Twitter and Facebook, even if they're only slightly better than the next best person, there's only going to be one firm anyway, and they can milk that slight advantage multiplied by a large number of people for a big profit. Yeah, Mike.
Doesn't this also vary based on the industry in which it takes place?
Yeah, I'll talk a bunch about that in a second, actually. Yeah, Evan?
Twitter is not making profits, actually. They're making huge losses.
Well, yeah, they're making paper profits on their IPO, most likely, but not yet. Yeah. Dave?
So does this mean when you have technology that can kind of substitute for a person's talent, for example, if you have a new graphic design program that makes it much easier, that just makes it so that this...
Well, we'll talk a little bit about that in 1 second. It's a little bit more complicated, but Bart, yeah.
Is it possible that if the poor became more productive, that would actually cause a loss in economic growth, because then there would be less of an incentive?
No, it wouldn't. But less of an incentive to become rich?
Well, if profits are driven towards zero.
Well, no, because the market always allocates things optimally. So if the poor became more productive, it would be less socially necessary to have productive people. And therefore, it wouldn't be important to have an incentive to have people like that, right? In other words, the whole logic of the market, right, this is the invisible hand, is it creates rewards in the places where there's social value to create those rewards, right? So if there were more poor people, there would be no social value in having people who are super productive, because there would be lots of good substitutes for those people. The reason why LeBron James commands a lot of money is so that people have an incentive to try to become like LeBron James, even if they can't. Philip? Yeah.
So the logic of competition would be revised to say that the marginal entrant earns zero profits, but if someone has sufficiently powerful specialized talent so that they are far more efficient at one industry than another, they can still earn revenue.
Yeah, and that's basically just the probabilistic thing that we were doing, right? That was exactly what it was showing. They look like smooth supply curves, but really those were uncertainty about the person's entry points, right? And the rent that someone earns is really how much they're better than the other people in terms of where they would be willing to enter. So, absolutely. Okay, so in the long run, it might be the case that profits on touch screen cell phones went to zero, right? Apple is probably not making that much money off the iPhone anymore because it's got so much competition, Samsung and so forth. But then Apple introduced the App Store, and that gave them a bit of an advantage for a while. Now, other phones now are starting to have as good app stores, so maybe they're losing their competitive advantage on that as well, right? So, while it's true that narrowly defined industries, and this is getting back to Mike's point, will tend to have a lot of ability to freely enter and drive profits out. For example, Nokia didn't last long as a cell phone behemoth because it was really easy to produce the cheap cell phones that they made. And American car companies, it was pretty easy to imitate, the Japanese showed, the processes and maybe even improve on the processes with which they made their cars, or to imitate the legacy airlines, which weren't doing anything special, and the low-cost airlines came in. But often broader industries are defined not by narrow, easily imitated individual products, but precisely by the process of constantly bringing out new products. So, Mike, what might be some examples of industries like that?
That are defined by new products?
Yeah.
Like, I don't think tablets really existed before the iPad came out, for example.
Yeah, that's right, but it's not the tablet industry. There's like a broader industry of consumer electronics in which it sits, because the tablet industry is not really defined by innovation, but the broader electronics industry is. So if you look narrowly at one segment, it's true. But the whole electronics industry is not about one segment. It's about constantly creating new segments, right? Yeah.
So is that basically saying, like, if you're Apple and you already have an advantage in innovation, you're just going to keep pushing the advantage, so you'll keep your rent?
Well, unless you have free entry into becoming an innovation hub like Apple does, which maybe in the very long run is true. But then people innovate a totally different type of firm, which isn't an innovation hub, but is a data hub. You see what I mean? So the more broadly you look, people may have abilities that are very hard to, in any reasonable time, enter into imitating. Google has a constantly expanding empire, right? Like, if they just sat on only doing search, they probably would have gotten superseded. But they've now moved into operating systems and Google Now and Maps. And by constantly adding these new services, that's how they stay ahead of the competition. Microsoft, on the other hand, thought that it could just rest on its patents and its operating system and its network effects. And then they got completely screwed because they realized that, you know, actually the next place was everything on the internet, and that the operating system on the actual computer didn't matter in the next round, right? And good innovation machines are hard to imitate. You need to imitate a process of generating ideas, not copying a particular technical process, right? And an engine like that often requires scarce talent, like Steve Jobs. Now, even in a narrow industry where prices will come down over time, especially in response to a demand shock, this doesn't always happen by new entrants coming in. It can actually happen with lower price and maybe a little bit lower quality. Instead, it can happen by the people at the top finding a way to reach everybody. And this is, I think, what Bart was getting at, or somebody was getting at before. Austin, yeah. And that can mean that the people at the top get a huge amount of rent, and the people at the bottom get driven out of the industry, rather than the people at the bottom driving out the profits for the people at the top. So, Rishi, can you think of some examples of that?
As in, like, for the just rents at the very top.
Where like the way that prices come down over time, or that an industry reacted to a demand shock, was not by a lot more crappy firms entering and driving down the prices for the few original firms, but rather that the few original firms found a way to reach the best firms. I mean, did reach everybody.
I don't know, like you were talking about LeBron before, professional sports in general.
Yeah.
Have the very top players make a lot of money and have a lot of demand, and the bottom players are either driven out, or the firms aren't really going to target them as much as they're trying to.
Yeah, so I mean, if you think about some demand shocks that you might think in the long run would be greeted by entry, like the increase during the baby boom in demand for popular music, that was not greeted by entry into the music industry. Actually, the number of musicians went way down. But what happened was that you developed this whole popular culture, radio, television, etc., that allowed the top people to reach many, many more people and drive out the people down below. Professional sports during the 20th century grew up as the demand for sports increased. But rather than that making there be more sports teams, it actually made there be less, because the top sports teams found ways to reach everybody. The fast food revolution was like this. Again, during the baby boom, there was demand for lots of standardized, relatively decent quality food, but rather than that leading to many more restaurants, it led to consolidation, and the few restaurants that were able to replicate the standards of quality most broadly took over the industry. This also happens with gourmet food, with celebrity chefs, where in the short term, increase in demand for gourmet foods might make lots of local restaurants, but maybe in the longer term, there will be a few celebrity chefs who, just like Rick Bayless, spread the tentacles of their empire all over the country. Or mass production of design during the 1950s, when people were getting to be more middle class and wanting, nicer designed products. What happened was not there was many more people going into handicrafts, but rather a few designers got big jobs designing mass market products that were then given to everyone. And I think this could well be an important part of the future of education and medicine. I say to all my colleagues that they should ask themselves the question, what is the most broadly defined class with the property that you are the single best person in the entire world to be teaching that class? Because that's how you're going to be making your money. Because with these MOOCs, if someone is not the absolute best, why even waste your time listening to them? Why not listen to whoever's the best at teaching that class, right? And similarly with medicine, why go to your local doctor who's maybe seen 1,000 patients in their whole life, rather than have statistical algorithms that take in all the information from all patients in the world and prescribe you the best treatment based on what we observe of you, and have doctors running those algorithms. That will make the doctors who are the best at analyzing the data, extremely wealthy, but it will put out of business all the other lower quality doctors, right? So this is called the superstar effect. And it means that if one individual can reach a very large part of the market, then the market adjusts by focusing more and more on those absolute top people rather than by having more people enter. And so while that does bring down prices and costs dramatically, it's not by more people entering, but actually by more technological focus on getting the top people to reach everybody. And in that type of an industry, the distribution of talent is absolutely crucial, because it determines rents and the nature of the long-term response. If you have more concentration of talent at the top, there's going to be a desire to try to get those top people to reach everybody, rather than to have the people who are just have more people enter into the industry, right? But note that it's not the entire distribution of talent that matters, only the people towards the top, right? Suppose that there were some people that were very good, but there was a large number of them, and that everybody else was really bad. Well, that would still sort of be like free entry, because there would be a large pool of people who would all be equally good to compete. What really matters is how differentiated things are at the very top of the distribution. And this top part of the distribution is called its tail. And if there are many people who are way out, no matter how far you get, there's still people who are further and further out, that's called a fat-tailed distribution. And this is where the geniuses are really much better than even the very good people. And there's a highly unequal distribution of talent. Another name that's used for this is called black swans, when you have the one very rare event being very, very important. Now, often it's assumed that distributions are thin-tailed. Many distributions are like this. So anytime you have a distribution that has finite upper and lower bounds, it's thin-tailed. And usually the most important thing about finite bounded distributions that's being assumed is not that they're bounded, but rather that they're thin-tailed. That's really what's being baked in. It's that you don't have these extreme events playing much of a role. Normal distributions are that way too. But we know that this is not consistent with a lot of the evidence that we have about the distribution of talent. In fact, most evidence we have shows that talent distribution is extremely fat-tailed. It follows what's called a power law or a Pareto distribution. Yeah, Philip.
What is a metric that's used to measure talent?
I'll go through some of those in just a second. Okay, but that distribution has the following form. The number of people who are above a given level is equal to that level divided by some constant to some power, to some negative power. So it dies off with a power of the level that you're at. Some ways of thinking about this distribution is the fraction of people who have talent above level 2 times x is 1 over 2 to the alpha of that above the level x. So let's say that if alpha is equal to 1.2, then about 20% of people will have 80% of the talent. If another way of putting it is that the 5th most talented person is 1 over 5 to the 1 over alpha, as talented as the most talented person. And these are a little bit tricky when alpha is not equal to 1, but the lower alpha is, the more unequal it's going to be. Because that means the more spaced out things are at the top relative to further down the distribution. Income, which is one measure of talent, is a power law with alpha but somewhere between 1.5 and 3. Wealth is somewhere between 1 and 2. CEO compensation has an alpha of about 3. But the most prominent one is alpha equal to 1, which is called Zipf's law, which says that the 5th most talented person is 1/5 as talented as the first most talented person. The 2nd most talented person is 1/2 as talented as the top person. So you see there's really big gaps at the top and smaller gaps as you go down. I'm going to show 2 examples of something following Zipf's law, but it also applies to comparative advantage of countries and things, to many areas of economics, where almost anywhere you look, you find power law distributions like this. Yeah, Austin.
How do you, when you're calculating like CEO compensation, the alpha value for that, how do you differentiate talent from nonlinear returns to talent?
I'm just saying you put in CEO pay and you get this distribution. That's all I mean.
Okay.
Yeah. Mike?
Can I ask about something on the
Yeah.
last slide? You said that thin-tailed distributions are implied by like boundedness.
Yeah, any bounded distribution is thin-tailed.
Wouldn't it be, but like if you're taking a distribution of like sports talent or something, there's got to be like a most talented person, right? Like aren't those still?
Yeah, so a lot of people think that way, and that's what led a lot of people to assume bounded distributions. But the thing is, well, that is true at literally the absolute top. Like, it's a lot of our models are like based on looking at limiting things, right? And when you look at limiting things, it's bad to assume something that where you're only looking at the behavior at the absolute top. You see what I mean? Like, it's like L'Hopital's rule, right? It's true that, like, you know, the top may be going to 0, but if the bottom's also going to 0, right, then you need to think about what does the behavior look like as you get towards the top. And the income distribution really looks like Pareto. Now, literally, there is a richest person, so it is bounded. But that's sort of not beside the point. The point is it looks like Pareto until the very end. Yeah, Dave?
What exactly does it mean for someone to be X times talented than someone else? Is this determined by their income?
Well, this is what Philip said. I was giving some examples of what I mean by that.
Okay.
So one example is income, but, you know, well, I'll give you some other examples in a second. Yeah, Tanner?
Like even if it might look like it's bounded now, like you might say LeBron is the best basketball player, would be better close, but in all time,
Yeah, exactly.
someone else could be.
Yeah, exactly. Philip? Yeah.
Well, if you use a physical metric of talent, such as movement speed for runners,
Yeah.
you might argue that.
It's thin-tailed. It'll be thin-tailed there.
Or certainly, there's got to be some sort of bound on how fast.
So that's absolutely right. So one interesting thing about this is usually these thin-tailed things have to do with cases where you're like measuring it in some objective unit, like height. Like imagine height is 1-to-1 with basketball skill, which it isn't, but imagine that. Then like clearly like there's a pretty thin-tailed distribution of height. It's just not going to get above a certain amount. But because of the superstar effect, those very top people, even the small distances, get magnified into these huge income differences, right? So, yeah. Yeah, Austin.
Is it treated as an economic question, the kind of reasoning behind those? Because I was just thinking like...
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So there are some papers behind them, but I don't find them ultimately convincing precisely on this point that I just said. Like, all the models that justify this are based on everything growing proportionately at a random rate. And that leads to this behavior on the upper tail. But I don't think that's what's going on. I don't think it has to do with the underlying physical properties of the growth. I think it has to do with the technology through which that thing reaches large numbers of people. And I think any good model of this has to somehow take that into account. And I don't think anyone's done that as far as I know.
So I'm just thinking like math talent, for instance, is much more fat-tailed than econ talent. There's many more math prodigies than there are econ prodigies.
Yeah, I mean, and I think again it has to do with like the selective process. I mean, so like one example of this is physical beauty. So like I think that in your, at least in my lived experience just going around, physical beauty is clearly thin-tailed. Like, you know, you meet someone who's beautiful versus someone who's very beautiful, and there's a difference, but like it sort of wears off pretty quickly as you get down that distribution. But for supermodels, that's not true at all, right? Like you could have slight differences and it would make an enormous difference in their income because they're reaching such a huge number of people. One way of thinking about the difference between thin tails and fat tails that I quite like is like a thin-tailed distribution is somewhere where as you're getting better and better at the thing, you feel more and more like I'm mastering this, I'm on top of this, I'm better than most people, whatever, right? Like driving is like that, typing is like that. You sort of like get comfortable with your level. But you know, economics or math or intellectual pursuits or money, all these sorts of things are fat-tailed because the better you get, the more you realize that the really top people are still way ahead of you, right? So that actually, there's a mathematical formulation in which that's exactly what thin-tailed versus fat-tailed means. It means as you get higher up, are you falling sort of behind the top or are you getting closer to the top? Okay, so here's some other things that follow Zipf's law. So firm size as a measured in the number of employees, if you graph the frequency against the size in log terms, you get a slope of -1. That indicates Zipf's law. Similarly, for city size within a country or in the world, there's almost a perfect fit. If you have the log of the rank of the city against the log of the population, you get almost a perfect -1 fit. And you'll see if you just look at like cities in any country, the second city is usually pretty close to half the size of the first. The third city is about a third the size of the first, etc. Yeah, Christian.
Wait, why does the -1 slope correspond to Zipf's law again?
Well, you basically take these things and you take the log of both sides of them, and you'll see you got a -1 in front of this guy, right? So, yeah. Okay. It also applies to words in any language, including English. So, yeah, Philip.
I'm just curious, is that generally true for only natural languages or also formal languages?
I don't know. Probably for formal languages, but I'm not sure. Okay, so this extreme heterogeneity at the top of the distribution, I think, raises some important questions. One is that, you know, rents might be quite important even in the long run because the free entry logic is not really going to be right. The people at the very top are going to appropriate a lot of those rents, and them reaching other people is going to be an important part. In some sense, we might think free entry is actually more of an anomaly rather than the rule. And what IP tries to do is to redress this failing of the market to follow its natural nature. Rather than thinking of free entry as the default, we might think that actually this talent stuff is the default. And IP is a way to restore the natural nature of the market, allowing people to appropriate those rents. If some firms are much bigger than other firms, it's unlikely that they're going to be price takers, right? Because if we have some people who are really, really big at the top, as we said, that's going to basically make a very concentrated industry and make those top people unlikely to be price takers, right? And that will create market power and motivate our study of market power later in the course. Also, it'll mean that the income distribution is very unequal at the top, which will make redistribution attractive and also mean that you can raise a lot of revenue by taxing the rich, because there will be, at any level that you tax people, a lot more people who are richer than that and who will pay the tax, but who won't actually want to reduce the amount that they work. So much of the rest of the course is going to be driven by these things that come out of the fact that we have these fat-tailed distributions of talent and income. Great.